Malcolm Salter has been a member of the Harvard Business School faculty since 1967. His teaching and research focus on issues of corporate strategy, organization, and governance. He's the author of many books and papers and case studies addressing issues of business policy and practice. He's also served as the president of an international strategy consulting firm, a trustee of multiple arts, educational, and medical institutions in the Boston area, and a director of multiple public and private companies, including most recently 4 bioscience startups focused on advanced cancer therapies. Rebecca Henderson is the John and Natty McArthur University Professor at Harvard University. She's a research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a fellow of both the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She has more than 25 years of major public board experience, and her research explores the degree to which the private sector can play a major role in building a more sustainable economy. Her publications include Accelerating Energy Innovation, Insights from Multiple Sectors, Leading Sustainable Change, an Organizational Perspective, and co-editing Contributions to Political Economy and Justice, a book that we collaborated on together. So both have been longstanding collaborators of mine, true friends and true intellectual fellow travelers. So it's just a true joy to have the chance to be in conversation with them today. With that, let me hand it over to Mal to introduce his important book.
Thanks, Danielle. It's great to be here, and thanks for all of you who are joining. I just want to set the table very, very briefly for a discussion that will follow. And I want to start just by saying that 10 years ago, 2015 or 16, when Danielle and I first met, we got into a discussion about, Danielle really asked me, what's this theory of stakeholder value all about? And so we talked about it a while. And at the end of the discussion, we obviously got into talking about capitalism and US-style capitalism. At the end of it, she says, Mal, do you have a definition of capitalism? And I said, well, I think I do. And she said, well, could you write me kind of a one-pager that explains, your view of capitalism? And I said, oh. I said, well, Danielle, there are many different kinds of capitalism. There's state-guided capitalism, there's welfare capitalism, there's autocratic or oligarchic capitalism, there's laissez-faire capitalism, there's monopoly capitalism. And Danielle said, well, just write what you think. Okay, so I went back and I maybe wrote a couple of paragraphs. And what I did was basically try to define for her what democratic capitalism was, which is where democratic capitalism refers to a form of political and economic governance that enables democratic politics and a market economy to coexist and prosper together. And that was sort of the first time I really kind of put down in very cogent language what my view of democratic capital was, both as a aspirational ideal and as a cornerstone of a sometimes espoused national ideology. 10 years, that's not actually what led to this book, but 10 years later, my immediate motivation for this extended essay was that I had 2 grandsons going off to college. They're identical twins. And usually what grandfathers do when their grandchildren go off to college is you say, well, here's a little money that you can use for spending until you get a job, and I didn't want to do that. So what I wanted to do was to write a letter to my 2 twin grandsons, Teddy and Nick, one who was off to study philosophy and political science, and the other off to study chemical engineering and quantitative economics. And in my letter, I was inviting them to pay attention to the diminished promise of democratic capitalism as a system of political and economic governance. And my letter was a way of saying to them, we're losing it, you're next up. And I wanted my grandsons to understand in this letter, which became this book, that as many as 60% of US adults no longer believe that our political economy is working for them. And this, despite the fact, since the 1950s, we've had unparalleled entrepreneurship and innovation, that we've had attractive economic growth and job expansion. The one summary statistics that The Economist likes to use on this is that in 1990, the US share of the G7's GDP was 40%. And the G7 is the US, Canada, France, Germany, UK, Italy, and Japan. So if all that together, our share was 40%. And today it accounts for about 60%, which is huge. That's absolutely huge. And there's high levels of annual income, average income in the US, certainly compared to China, Germany, Japan. And although I must say that the average annual income disguises a lot of important data. So I wanted my grandsons to understand that there were many reasons for this diminishing appeal of our governance system, all of which I review in the book. But among the plausible reasons for this diminishing appeal that I wanted my grandsons to understand was that the totally toxic combination of perversive cronyism on one hand, coupled with restricted suffrage on the other hand, has led many citizens to feel that our system of economic and political governance is rigged against them and frozen them out of the nation's political processes. And that this toxic duo of cronyism and restricted suffrage is an absolute deal killer for the idea that democratic capitalism can continue to serve as either a realistic aspiration for the US, in the US, or a cornerstone of our national ideology and dreams. So with this as background, what I was saying to my grandsons, I hope you can find time in your university studies to consider such questions as, what is democratic capitalism? What does it entail as a governance system? How is this governance system evolving? And what's the current status of it as a national ideal? How is cronyism and restricted suffrage killing democratic capitalism? And why is this duo so toxic? What does the renovation of democratic capitalism require? What specific changes in economic and political governance are necessary to rescue democratic capitalism from its decline in public support and to reverse all these ill effects that I just mentioned? Most importantly, actually, from a conceptual point of view, I wanted them to think about what principles should guide the renovation of democratic capitalism and why are principles important in this way. And that, I must say, is this is where Danielle comes in. I don't know if you could see it. This is Justice by Means of Democracy. This is a book that's been read many times, if you can look and see at all of that. And I was basically asking them to be very aware of what principles should guide the renovation of democratic capitalism. I'm happy to talk about that later. I also want them to consider how business firms, arguably the most important social institution that we have, basically can become more democracy supporting, a challenge that Danielle has thrown at my feet many, many times. And our discussant today has written brilliantly on in her book, and particularly in her work that relates to firms as cooperative systems. And finally, I wanted them to think about what kind of an ethical culture or set of shared beliefs and values that affect behavior is necessary to support this kind of governance system. And these 6 questions basically comprise the substantive discussion in my book. So there's lots that we can discuss today, including what are the essential steps that we need to take here. But I'd like to suggest, before we kind of open it up, that we not lose sight of the core principles that I think need to understand whatever structural and cultural changes we argue for. For me, the most important and absolute core principle is the principle of political equality, which is argued by Danielle in her book. And that's because no activity, in my mind, such as democratic capitalism, can claim to be democratic unless the principle of political equality is baked into that activity. It's as simple as that. If we're going to talk about democratic capitalism, we have to talk about political equality. I also discuss and apply in my extended essay 2 sub-principles of political equality, and that's reciprocity and power sharing. Power sharing is the tangible evidence that reciprocity, as well as political equality, is at work in the political economy. And I give examples of that, you know, in the book. I'm going to not attempt to summarize how all these core principles drive the various changes that I'm recommending in the book. But I do want to create, as a final comment here, my sense of urgency. When I was an undergraduate at Harvard College in the late 50s and early 60s, I was exposed to a historian named Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee was a historian at Balliol College, Oxford. He spent 25 years studying 21 civilizations, and he wrote 12 volumes. The last volume came out in 1961. And I remember walking from my room in Leverett House to the Harvard Coop to get the book, the final book. And I went into the Harvard Coop and I went upstairs in the back in those days. And I went and I got his final volume. And I had read so much Toynbee that I decided that first what I was going to do was go to the table of contents. In the table of contents at the bottom, there was a chapter called Conclusion. So I immediately turned to the conclusion and I opened up the back of the book. And at the title, I can't remember what it was, the title or in the first sentence, Toynbee said, civilizations die by suicide, not by murder. In other words, they do it to themselves. And I think we're doing it to ourselves. And so it's up to us, I think, to turn things around. Hence the letter to my grandsons, and hence the book that is now out.
Great. Thank you so much, Mal. I'm sure when we get to the Q&A, I'll come back and ask you about some concrete examples of the kinds of changes you think are necessary. Yeah. And Rebecca may be commenting on that too. But let me hand it over to Rebecca and then we'll move forward. Thank you.
Danielle, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And Mal, thank you for writing this wonderful book, which I'm holding up to demonstrate that it's extremely thin.
Yeah.
So you can read it in a very brief time. And to Danielle's point, it's got some fantastic examples in it. I thought, Mal, particularly your discussion of the state of democracy in Massachusetts, which is dreadful. And I've lived here for more than 40 years, and I had no idea what a terrible state Massachusetts democracy was in. So well worth the price of admission just for that. But it's really an extraordinary book, and I enjoyed it very much. It's got a very cogent analysis of what's going wrong in our political system and a number of solutions, some of them at a fairly high level. So Mal, I completely share your enthusiasm for Danielle's book. And you talk about the need for political equality and the need to contain cronyism. These are major political shifts, as I know you know. And I think particularly at this moment, none of us have a good idea exactly how we're going to do things like make our system more majoritarian, make sure that everyone feels included in the political process, give people practice in engaging in democracy so that that builds up to an understanding of democracy and its important role at every level in the society. And for me, and here I'm drawing on Martha Nussbaum and others, how do we build again a love for the nation? Not a patriotic, flag waving, but a love for the nation in all its complexity, such that I am wanting to connect with others in it, and I'm committed to the ideals, and I'm willing to share power because I love the greater good of the entire society. I have no idea how we rebuild that, but that seems to me critical. In the book, as I read it, you focus particularly on one class of solutions, which is creating firms or transforming firms away from extractive capitalism, moving firms away from it's all about the money, we will do anything to make money, including subvert the democratic system and drive wages to the bottom. You imagine and explore the degree to which we can move firms towards a much more fairer, relational way of being. You use the term creating a relational environment. You talk about power sharing. In my own work, I talk about the difference between low road firms, sort of very extractive, doing everything they can to make money. Some of the private equity firms in healthcare are demonstrating right now why that's such a destructive way to run a private firm. And high road firms, those that treat individuals with dignity and respect, that are deeply rooted in what in my scholarly work I call relational contracts. That is the understanding that we're in this for the long term, that we're building something together. And of course, there's a spectrum of different kinds of firms, but as a first pass, I think one of the questions you're asking is, if we could move a bunch of firms towards that more high road, more relational direction, might that be helpful? What would it look like? And since that's a problem I'm deeply interested in, I really enjoyed the book. I think you suggest broadly two ways of making that shift. And before I discuss those two ways, I think you hint, but in my own work, I think it's really important to think about this. Why would moving firms in this direction make a real difference? I think they might be much less inclined to engage in crony capitalism, and they might be the kind of seedbed of democracy and agency. Now, I suspect some of you listening to this are like, you're crazy, firms as seedbeds of democracy. But we could imagine firms that are structured as cooperative, firms in which workers have a very important share in how the firm is run. In my own experience, I've certainly discovered that high road firms generate much higher levels of agency and self-confidence in many of the people that work for them. So I think there are many reasons to think that having a group of firms moving in this direction would make a big difference. And indeed, if you look at what's driven the kind of major political structural shifts that we've seen that have really driven significant political change, having some portion of the commercial elite, some portion of business moving with the more progressive elements of society has proven to be very helpful. So I can see all kinds of reasons for moving firms in this direction. That said, I just want to bookmark what we all know, which is getting major political change in the state is really what we need. That firms on their own are most unlikely to make this transition to make it possible. They're more like helpful allies, elements of the system, but we're not going to get rid of crony capitalism or restricted access to the ballots or create new kinds of parties without serious political change. So having said that, what are kind of the two avenues we have that could move firms in this more productive, engaged, treating people in a really, as human beings and delegating power and inviting them into the governance of the firm? What would do that? So Mal, in your book, you talk about structural solutions. So deepening and broadening the ability of firms to create cooperatives, self-governing cooperatives. At the moment, we have laws on the books and issues in how bonds are written and how the financial markets work that make it really quite tough to set up cooperative firms. They are out there, they are thriving. You give Publix and a number of other examples in the book, but it's tricky to run a cooperative at the moment. So we could, move. Firms themselves could choose to structure as cooperatives, and we can reduce the regulatory, legal, and financial barriers that make it more difficult to structure as a cooperative. You talk about the possibility of involving unions in the firm and the way in which regimes of co-determination have been really quite successful in Germany and in a different form, but also in Japan, in ensuring that capitalism is at the service of society, not the other way around. I think we have lots of historical evidence that increasing worker representation and a voice for employees in all different kinds of ways can make a real difference. My experience with most firms is they're very reluctant to do that. So again, that's something where we need some kind of external pressure. And you also talk about benefit corporations. and a little bit about maybe changing the definition of fiduciary duty away from the perception that it's all about shareholder value maximization, really underlining that the fiduciary duty of the director is to the best long-term interest of the corporation. Then I think the core of the book, you turn to creating a relational environment. Can we imagine that firms themselves can introduce things like labor management committees, employee engagement, that they can become more purpose-driven, and that this is a way to move forward? And you talk about changing the moral environment. And I both love this and am aware of the issues around it. So I love it because I spent at least 15 years of my life working with purpose-driven corporations. I know these firms exist, often led by deeply morally motivated leaders, deeply committed to their employees, their customers, and the communities that they're part of. And you yourself mentioned that in the 40s and 50s, this was not an unusual way to lead an American firm. And you point to the Committee for Economic Development, which played, hold on, sorry.
Must be having a technology issue here.
Yes, it's just going to take a moment. I got it. Sugar. I'm sorry. I'm in a brand new office and online for the first time, and I'm getting classic. But I'm fixing it. There we go. Here we go. Fixed. Sorry about that. Okay, so I've worked with firms that have moved in this direction, run by deeply inspiring leaders, delegating power. I know it's possible, and as you write in your book, this was not unusual in the 40s and 50s. There was a dominant intellectual environment, partly created by the Committee on Economic Development, that firms should be in service to the society. And you use that as an example of the kind of social movement that might really lead to this change in the overall moral, intellectual, strategic milieu in which firms move. I think this is really interesting, and certainly in my own work, and when I published my book, Reimagining Capitalism, I was hoping to contribute to that kind of shift in understanding among business leaders, calling out successful firms, suggesting that there's no reason to think they are less economically successful. I think, in fact, there's a lot of research to say they are just as economically successful and often more agile and more productive. So, and trying to make that like the water we swim in. If you're a business leader, of course, you'll run your firm in this way. So I'm deeply sympathetic to the argument. But I want to raise a number of caveats and suggest that perhaps we need to look at the intersection between business and the society if this is going to happen. So my biggest caveat is that we're in a very different moment now than we were 5, 10, 15 years ago. That the kind of unrestrained, completely extractive capitalism is ascendant. And while there are many business leaders who in private will express despair, it's really taken hold in a deep level. So I don't think this shift is going to happen without major political change. So the model, when we talk about social movements, the model for me is social movements in the old-fashioned sense, insisting on fundamental shifts in our political arrangements. And I'm a little bit worried about the Committee on Economic Development as an example, because the 40s and 50s, the American economy was ascendant over the whole world, almost more ascendant than it is now. And unions were strong, and we had democratic presidents who were very much on this wavelength. So yes, the committee was important, but there were also important structural factors in place. So how might I formulate this argument now? I published my own book 5 years ago, wrote it 2 years before, a year before that. So it's 6 years old. How am I thinking about things now? I too am thinking about a moral and cultural shift, because my understanding of many social movements is they are deeply rooted in a sense of moral injury and a demand for change. So I think it is a moral and cultural shift, but I think it's more radical than the one you're suggesting, or at least I'm open to something much more radical, which is what we are doing now is really not working. To the puzzle between the gap between the US economy is a much greater share of the world economy, but many people are very unhappy. As we know, most of that new wealth has gone to the very top of the society. And at the same time, the healthcare system is falling apart. The environment is falling apart, even if we don't use the word climate change in public under the new regime. Floods and fires and storms are continuing to come. And we have jobs, but they don't pay very well. Major affordability crisis. So I think if I were writing my book now, I would think about the interaction between the new form of capitalism you point to, firms that are much more inclusive, much more democratic, much more aligned with the overall society, and the broader political movement we need. What does that intersection look like? Can firms be political agents? I've been in a number of group calls trying to urge senior CEOs to become more politically engaged, and it's not something they're very comfortable with for all kinds of structural reasons. If I were running a firm with 100,000 employees and in a political regime deeply hostile to my behaving in different ways, I would absolutely hesitate. So are we talking about coalitions? Are we talking about under the radar, sort of doing it at a community level where we try it out at the state or town level? What does this process of change actually look like? I don't think we know at all, but I'm absolutely open to firms having a role because economic activity is so important and so much a part of where we are. And let me close by, I don't know if this is good news or bad news. I am split. But the examples I know of from history in places like Chile, Denmark, Mauritius, Germany, in places where the business sector started to work aggressively with labor and civil society to reformulate politics, to rethink what democracy meant in the service of the whole society, they did it because their societies had essentially fallen apart. In one case, in Denmark, they'd lost a major war. In Germany, it was in the ruins of World War II that the new system grew up. In Chile, it was because the whole economy was collapsing. In Mauritius, there were massive riots in the streets and it wasn't going to work. So do we only see these big shifts at a moment of enormous stress? That could be bad news. But the kind of good news is I think we're going to have moments of enormous stress. And those kinds of moments can trigger fundamental change. So I loved your book. I recommend it to everyone on the call as really a great place to start thinking about these problems and a doorway into a really important issue.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I think what I'm going to do just is make a few comments, and then Danielle, if that's correct, open it up. Is that what you'd like to do?
Exactly.
Thank you so much, and it's really important to me and gratifying to me that you've taken the time to look at the book, because I think you have a lot to say on this as well. I want to make a comment on your comments that relate to both firms and then the system, if I can. In terms of relationality, in firms, you're quite right. We actually, We actually have firms here in the US who have been quite relational over a period of time. And they fall into two classes. One, they're basically still family-owned firms, and they're private, or they're firms that have gotten into economic problems. So that there are firms such as, Public Markets, William Gore, Patagonia, for example, they have their system. Patagonia is not an ESOP, and the first two are. Patagonia is a B Corp. I was the director of a company. I went through a B Corp. I could see what that does. But there are other companies, who have developed the kind of internal relationships that you're talking about, that I'm talking about here, because of adversity. Weir and Steel was the first example of that. It was existential danger, and they had to actually come together and work to pull themselves together. I spent a lot of time on the Saturn Corporation, which is the GM effort, basically to kind of re-establish sort of all the governance rules of setting up a separate corporation. And I developed that as well. And that was the question of survival over the influx of small cars. But there were a lot of also joint management employee committees during World War II. In the 1980s, there were a lot of these kind of more relational enterprises, both in multi-party committees in textiles, clothing, semiconductors, telecommunications, healthcare, all of which I studied with John Dunlop in our course here at the Kennedy School, during those years. And today we've got, probably the most wonderful example, which is Kaiser Permanente. And so, which I'm sure you know very well. So there are examples. We've done this. So I mean, there is a history here. And to your second point of how do we move, how do we move systemically in that direction? This is near and dear, to my heart as well, because I do think we're under duress, and I do think we need to change it. And we could talk about the institutional and cultural changes that I'm proposing here. But I do think that what's really important is that there are two ways to go. There's a way, which I talk about in the book. There is the whole question of evangelism. You're an evangelist, okay? Danielle, when she talks about democracy, is an evangelist. Larry Lessig, is another person from the university who's an evangelist as well. We need evangelists, and there are people that and that I know, both whether it be at the Business Roundtable, at the Conference Board, whether it be at the Aspen Institute, or whether it be at the Problem Solvers Caucus, or serving in various state and national legislative bodies. There are people who can be, I think, very effective evangelists. But evangelists alone can't do it. I think you're correct. That's not enough, which has got me to the whole question of collective action. And I think I'd like to invite us all, to think about, collective action here, because never have we had more knowledge, about what's needed than we do, right now. And I think that that collective action, and we have some models to look at, and I've been looking at those models. I looked at CED at its early stages. I looked at the Federalist Society is an extraordinarily successful, model of change. The Tea Party was. Deborah Woodley's book on BLM, Black Lives Matter, that was extraordinary. I think the Partners in Democracy, which Danielle is leading, is part of that as well. And what's common to all of those? Here's the good news. What's common to all of those successful movements, or even American Promise, which is trying to repeal, the Citizens United. What is common to all of these is how much work went at the front end. Investment. This is just not like this. It was a tremendous amount of front end work that was done. There has been an enormous amount of front end work done on the issues that we're talking about. And so the question is, how do we build this movement? And I think we have some examples out there to follow. And I do think collectives are very important for a whole variety of reasons, specifically for the business community, as well. And there, I think that's the path that I think is important. By the way, closure is, Danielle. This is why I think, for example, what Danielle's doing in Partners in Democracy, both in Massachusetts, which is where their data came from, and in Ohio, is I mean, not only is Massachusetts and Ohio a beta site for something bigger for Partners in Democracy, which we could talk about later, but the whole idea is a beta site for what a collective action could be. I think that's where it happens. And you're quite right. I think that has to be done with, and I think this is true in not all of the examples that I used, but in the ones that I particularly find attractive, there is a love of nation there. And I think that Paul Hoffman from Studebaker Corporation, who ran the Committee for Economic Development in the 30s, the 40s, and 50s, and the Marshall Plan in Europe after that, there was a great love for country. And I think that's a very important motivating part. I don't want to take any more time. I want to send it back to Danielle, and we can pursue that. Thank you so much. Thank you really so much, Rebecca.
Yeah, no, thank you both for a very rich conversation. So I'm going to ask just one question to kick it off, and then we do have a lot of questions in the Q&A.
Good.
Those, but I also encourage everybody listening to keep adding your questions to the Q&A queue, please. I want to distinguish between the what and the how, and I want to ask a question about the what, first of all. I think lots of the questions are about the how, and so we'll get to that too. But on the what, you both have a different vision of capitalism. You're both reimagining capitalism. And there's one piece of your vision that I still am not entirely clear on. So you both have clarity about high-minded firms, so to speak. So high-minded firms are operating with a sense of their obligation to the broader society. They're not extractive. They have the capacity for democratic organization internally. They might be even cooperatives, changing ownership patterns, changing who has a stake in capital, et cetera. Lots to the picture of that. And I think the thing I'm still struggling to clarify for each of you is the relationship between those high-minded firms and the broader economic system. So Rebecca, you referred to collapse around the capacity to deal with climate, to actually in the US establish a resilient healthcare system that's genuinely serving all and supporting health for all. So the thing I think I'm unclear about slightly is it your view that if we have sort of scaled out network of high-minded firms, they will function in ways that drive a difference in policy outcomes on their own? Or is your view that one of those things the high-minded firms do is engage with the political system in a different way, such that the political system is now in a better position to solve these problems, i.e. by not leveraging capital to control the system only in the direction of supporting profit? So it might be either solution pathway that you're pointing to, and I'm slightly unclear which pathway you are each pointing to. I might go to Rebecca first and then Mal, if that's okay on this.
Sure. So Danielle, I do not believe high-minded firms on their own can drive the kind of change we need. I think they might be an element in a coalition that help to drive real policy change. But we need serious policy change. Mal's very focused on this in his book. Changing campaign finance laws, the repeal of Citizens United, changing access to the ballot. I mean, there's all kinds of solid changes we need. I mean, including, it's much easier to be a high-minded firm if you have decent minimum wage laws and protection against discrimination. And, there's a whole legal regime that supports and encourages a better form of capitalism. And originally I got interested in this because I thought high-minded firms are good allies in driving you towards that better form because they do better under these highly regulated and controlled in the service of the whole community regimes. And so I always thought of them as allies, not as the answer.
Got it. Okay.
Mal?
Yeah, so I would agree that it's very difficult for individuals to make a mark here, particularly from the business community. And I think it's also, it takes an awful lot of skill collectively, even on how you want to deal with policy, particular policy issues that affect your own wealth position as a firm. My view on this is that I think business people ought to be very, very, very active, but I think they ought to be active on the basis of principles, talking about the principles. This is why I made a statement about this at the front end. What are the principles that underlie democratic capitalism? And I think to have individuals as well as groups of individuals talking at that level, what's the principle here that we're trying to work out in for our love of nations? What's required for this amazing system that we've put into place to survive? Don't forget what Marx said. Marx said, if you want capitalism, forget democracy. If you want democracy, forget capitalism. What we have done is somehow like a Venn diagram, we've kind of put this fragile marriage together, of democracy and capitalism. And it's turned out to, certainly in the post-war period, to have enormous positive effects. But to sustain that, we have to be aware of what are the principles that makes it work. So I think you said something, Danielle, in the talk that you gave when you stepped down from the Suffrage Center. And you said it with a smile on your face as you walked away from the podium. And what you said was you were making a comment on philosophy. And you said with a big smile on your face about philosophers, don't leave home without one. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that the way we have to talk about saving democratic capitalism from itself is not only to talk about all the policy stuff that I could talk about, but what are the principles and why are these principles important? And that would be my point.
That's helpful. So in other words, what I'm hearing is three things, actually. I'm hearing a story where firms themselves need to be different kinds of firms. That is to say, they have to have a different relationship to their own purpose and therefore a different relationship to capital. And that internally, even just to the existence of a firm, is a different relationship to power and how power gets shared. That's sort of like thing one that we need. Thing two that we need is a decoupling of capital and political power in our political system. We need governance to be returned to the hands of the people. Firms may have their role to play, but it should be right-sized. It shouldn't be the current kind of situation we have where power is so concentrated with holders of capital, thanks to Citizens United and other provisions. But then we also need a third thing. Mal, you're saying that insofar as firms should continue to have a civic role, have a voice in society and so forth, they need to learn how to use their voice in a pro-society way,
right.
Not merely in a pro-capitalism or pro-profit kind of way. And that's sort of a moral cause that you're describing. So in other words, transformation requires all three transformations, I think is what I
Right. And I would just say as a footnote to that while capital, in the system has its reserve price, so do other constituencies have their reserve price for participating in the system. And if those reserve prices aren't met over time, it's problems.
Right. Which is more or less where we are in effect. So the reserve price for most of us hasn't been met recently, and that's why we have a crisis of legitimacy and reasonable crisis of legitimacy, basically. So, all right. So a few questions then coming in that pick up on these themes. From Mary Beth, what role can Congress play in restraining firms, especially to fix market abnormalities such as healthcare? How do we incite Congress to pass more legislation? I guess that gets votes from both parties. I guess maybe let me just do the first half of that. What role can Congress play in restraining firms in order to fix market abnormalities? Do we see any forward path there or specific kinds of regulation that would be useful? I don't know which of you would want to.
Well, I would just say to that one there, I would step back. It's a very important question, but I would step back and I would say, let's make sure we get the right people in Congress, and that and as you look at the information, for example, that I give in the book on Massachusetts, which basically comes from the work that Danielle and others have done in the Partners for Democracy. The barriers to getting elected are so high. The right to get on a ballot are so high that people aren't voting. You're not hearing people's voice because they have candidates that they're not interested in. So I think that the question of how do you get Congress, to work in a way that reflects, the will of the polis, as opposed, to the will of people who have the ear of the man in the office. I think it relates to who's there and who's not capitulating. And I go way back in the food chain and say, how do we get the right people in Congress? And that's why there's a whole bunch of institutional stuff that I'm very much interested in with respect to campaign finance, reform, and also just strengthening, citizen voice in a whole variety of ways.
Okay, so the actions of Congress that we need depend first on having Congress function.
Yeah.
Rebecca, do you have a view there?
And there's a whole range of policies that a Congress that cared about this could enact, including, regulation of pollution and ensuring that jobs are good jobs and making it easier to manage a firm democratically. But I'm with Mal. The problem is getting a Congress that's interested in doing that. And that requires the kinds of reforms that Mal outlined. And of course, incumbents have less incentive to enact reforms that reduce the odds that incumbents will be re-elected, which is why we need broadly based social movements insisting on these kinds of changes to even get that change in, get those things in train.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, let me grab a couple of questions that are about how we got here. And then after that, we'll turn to some questions that are about how we get out of here. So, you, Mal, mentioned Citizens United, and by talking about stakeholder capitalism in contrast to shareholder capitalism, you've both implicitly invoked Friedman and his important article about the only purpose of business being to return value to shareholders. And the like. I think both of those things are things people peg as, the sort of the cause of our downfall. Does one matter more than the other? How do you really pry apart the causes of where we are right now with a capitalism that has moved way far outside of the Venn diagram supporting the fragile connection between democracy and capitalism?
Well, sorry. Yeah.
No, Mal, go.
Yeah, I've been sort of a part of this. Look, what happened in the 1970s is that there was a major shift in corporate thinking about the purpose of the firm. And this happened at Chicago, it happened at Rochester, and it happened at the Harvard Business School as well. Not completely, but there were groups of people who were very much committed, to the idea and to the idea that the sole legitimate purpose of the enterprise is to maximize shareholder wealth, period, end of argument. And that was that became canonized over a period of time for a whole variety of reasons, not the least of which was that there was some partial truth to this. That canonization took place in a period where there were many firms in the Fortune 500 or the Fortune 500 who couldn't earn their cost of capital on a sustained basis, and therefore were systematically destroying real economic value independent of what the stock price was. So people like Mike Jensen came by and said, well, why are we fritting away all our income? And it's because mainly we're spending R&D on wrong stuff. And that there was too much inattention, to shareholder interests rather than the interests of either laziness in the organization or to basically trying to do short-term kinds of stuff to maximize the firm. He was very effective at this. I taught with him and fought with him every morning that we taught from 6 to 8 before we went into class. I finally had a defect and teach my own class. But he was enormously successful. His course was like the required elective at the Harvard Business School. And for 20 years, people went off into private equity, went off into Wall Street with this idea in mind. And he wrote amazing articles in the Harvard Business Review, amazing books published by the Harvard University Press. And it really was a revolution. But it is a very narrow view of the firm. And this is how we got there, okay? There was a religious conversion, plus the fact it gave cover to a lot of people who needed legitimacy and cover, and particularly, I would say, the bad actors in the private equity business, in the buyout business. There's some good people in the buyout business, and I'd love to talk to you about that, but there are also some bad actors in that business as well. So we've had sort of a major cultural change, that took place as a result. And that's how we got into that. That's how we got into that whole area. How we get out of it, you may want to defer that, to another.
Let's hold on to how we get out of it for a second. Let's hear Rebecca how we got into it, and then I'll come back.
Yeah.
So I agree completely with Mal as to the proximate cause. I would add two things. One of the reasons Jensen was so successful is the adoption of this ideology enabled many people to make enormous amounts of money by managing in much more simplified ways. Not having to care about other constituencies makes management much easier, at least in the short term. The second point I would make is I think we are now seeing that there is a downside to basically how we've built our civilization. That, to go back to Polanyi, we thought we could make everyone rich. We could give everyone enough to eat, a place to live, and decent medical care. And that what we needed was just to let the free market go and not to worry about the externalities that created, the carbon we pumped into the atmosphere, the forests we cut down, the communities we destroyed, because it was in the service of this wonderful goal, which was to really make people prosperous and happy. And we made a lot of people very prosperous and very happy. But the costs of ignoring the side effects of economic activity, ruthless economic activity at this scale over time, is coming back to us. In mental illness, in epidemics of loneliness, in jobs that feel meaningless, in storms and floods and fires. It's, when you ask what caused this, we thought we could control the world. And, there would be a few people hurt along the way. And I mean, we ignored the, it's very deep. It's very, very deep. The problems we face go very deep. And the place I'm not going, because we only have 5 minutes, is to the whole discussion of coloniality and the othering of people who are non-white and non-female, and the exploitation on which so much of our early capitalist society was based. And that plays over into an ideology which is all about me, all about stuff, and all about status. At some deep level, this is Mal, I think, playing your tune, we lost the sense of what human life is about and about what we're trying to achieve as a society, and thought it was about maximizing shareholder returns. And it's not.
Okay.
Can I add one thing, Danielle, quickly in the last minute?
I can ask one more question, Mal, okay?
Oh, okay, one more question. Okay, go ahead.
I want to get, now that's a very intensely painted picture of how we got here. I don't want us to leave us there. I want us to now figure out, okay, what are our next steps for getting out? And there are a couple of questions that said, but look, firms have been trying through ESG and DEI and other activities to change their purpose, and there's been a lot of backlash. Somebody else asked about, well, what kind of incentives do firms need in order to make this change and the like? And you've both spoken to those in some ways, but I think your points have also been, for firms to have different incentives through regulation, we actually need a different politics. And then that brings us back to the collective action point. So in that regard, I know neither of you, is a grassroots organizer. Neither of you is, let's call it front lines of collective action. Nonetheless, from where you sit, if you were sort of waving a magic wand and some collective action was coming into existence, like what would you see as the first steps that need to be taken to build that larger field of coordinated effort?
So Mal, I will answer in a minute and leave you the rest of the time. In a minute, efforts at the community level, where community is defined not just geographically, but also by industry or profession or firm, which unite a new focus on what it means to be human and what our goals are, with ruthless strategic understanding of what it takes to drive change and act in different ways. And I think I can see those centers emerging all over the world. And I hope that they will complement, join, and form the kinds of deeply rooted networks that we need to drive political change.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I would add one thing. When I listen to Rebecca, it reminds me of that famous article by Ann Swindler in the American Swidler in the American Sociology Review back in the 80s, which was about culture, and change and how you change. And she points out that there sort of are two scenarios. There's a scenario where you've got settled periods and nothing is really up for change. And then you've got unsettled periods where folks feel that society has stopped working for them and they can abandon their old habits and do something. I think we're in scenario 2 right now, which I think that collection action has more of an opportunity now than it did 10 years ago. Let me put it that way. And I think that the adverse side effects of paying so little attention to the side effects of what we're doing are so high that I think the time for collective action is here. And the question is, where do we get the language system to talk about it intelligently, at least from the business community's point of view and from the university's point of view? And I think we have it. We have it. We just have to use it now. And that's the point. And I think that is something that, in terms of movements, frankly, I think the Harvard Business School should find ways of encouraging that, which we are. I think there are other parts of this university who are also engaged in these issues, and they're partners as far as I'm concerned.
So civil society has a lot of
Civil society.
that we're only just
I have a thing on that, on civil society here. I'm with you 100%.
Find our muscles.
The education for the civil society.
Remember how we can, as civil society actors and leaders, dig deep and coordinate for the sake of a better path towards human flourishing, putting the human at the center, Rebecca, to your point, and the hopes each of us has just for fulfilling life, right? Flourishing and fulfilling life is very simple at the end of the day, but it's too far from where we start now in many of our public conversations. So thank you so much. I mean, this is such a thought-provoking, wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful to you for your time. And thank you all of you who joined us. I know we didn't get to everybody's question, but I hope we got to a good number of them. And certainly, I think we hit some important themes. So thanks for joining us. And we'll hope that you'll come along to the next conversation. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Rebecca.